Hey guys, tonight we are going to step back in time, not to a grand palace or a legendary battlefield, but onto the deck, creaking deck of a pirate ship during the golden age of piracy. Forget the dashing heroes with their clean, white puffy shirts and charming smiles. The reality was, well, a lot more fragrant. Frankly, if you were dropped onto one of these ships, the smell alone might make you jump overboard. It's an adventure. Alright, but one where your primary goal is probably just to avoid getting a rash. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, take a deep breath. No, wait, maybe don't. The first thing that hits you isn't the salty sea air you imagine. It's a thick, almost solid world of smell. It's a complex bouquet, a symphony of stink that tells the entire story of this vessel. There's the low, sour note of bilge water sloshing in the belly of the ship, a stagnant soup of seawater, leaked cargo, and things you'd rather not identify. Layered on top is the pungent aroma of unwashed humanity. Dozens of men packed into a space smaller than a modern-day studio apartment, all sweating under the Caribbean sun. Then, there's a whiff of old, rotting food, a hint of sickness, and the sharp, almost reassuring scent of cheap rum that tries, and fails, to mask everything else. This is your new home. Welcome aboard. You look around, trying to get your bearings on the tilting deck. The ship, likely a captured merchant sloop or schooner, feels both impossibly large and claustrophobically small at the same time. Every surface is coated in a thin, greasy film of salt, dirt, and something else. The wood under your feet is darkened, perpetually damp. Ropes, thicker than your arm, bristling with splinters, are coiled everywhere like sleeping snakes. You have to constantly watch your step to avoid tripping into a pile of discarded equipment or a puddle of who knows what. This era, the so-called golden age of piracy, spanning roughly from the 1650 seconds to the 1730 seconds, wasn't really a choice for the romantic or the adventurous. That's a story we tell ourselves now. For most of the men here, this life was an escape. They were fleeing the brutal discipline, miserable pay, and appalling conditions of the Royal Navy or merchant fleets. On a Navy ship, you could be whipped for a minor infraction. Here, you at least had a vote. This brings us to a major point of discussion among historians. The pirate code. Was it a pioneering form of maritime democracy? A radical social experiment on the high seas? Or was it just a pragmatic set of rules to keep a bunch of desperate, armed men from killing each other over a piece of bread? The truth is, we're still debating how idealistic versus how brutally practical these codes actually were. They varied from ship to ship, but the core principles were often the same. A share of the loot for every man, rules for discipline, and compensation for injuries. A lost arm might get you a larger share than a lost eye. It was a brutal form of insurance. As you stand there, a man brushes past you, and you instinctively recoil. His clothes are a patchwork of fabrics, stiff with grime and salt. His beard is matted, and his skin has the weathered, leathery look of someone who has never known the luxury of shade. He grins, revealing a few lonely, brown teeth, and claps you on the shoulder. The gesture is friendly, but you're mostly focused on the cloud of tiny insects that seem to wake from his hair. Here's a little detail you might not consider. The ship itself is basically a giant, floating sponge. These wooden vessels were never truly waterproof. Water seeped in through the hull, dripped through the decks, and ensured a constant state of dampness. This environment was just uncomfortable. It was a perfect breeding ground for mold, mildew, and all sorts of tiny organisms that thrived in the dark, white corners of the ship. The idea of dry was a luxury you wouldn't experience again until you made landfall. If you were lucky, the crew didn't just live on the ship. They became part of its grimy, damp ecosystem. And as the sun begins to set, casting long, dancing shadows across the deck, you realize you haven't even figured out where you're supposed to sleep yet. You look at the crowded, swaying space below deck, and a sense of deep foreboding begins to settle in. The adventure is just beginning. As darkness fully blankets the sea, the man who clapped your shoulder, the one with the questionable dental situation, jerks his head toward a dark, square hole in the middle of the deck. A hatch. He grunts something that sounds like down you go and then wanders off, presumably to find his own little slice of paradise. You cautiously approach the opening. A rickety ladder descends into an even thicker darkness, and the wave of concentrated stench that wafts up is so powerful it almost makes your eyes water. It's the same bouquet as before, but now it's been aging in an enclosed space with no ventilation. It has notes of stale breath and damp wool now. Delicious. You take a deep breath of the relatively fresh sea air luxury you're already learning to appreciate and begin your descent. The rungs of the ladder are slick, and you grip them tightly, your knuckles white. You emerge onto what's known as the berth deck or the gun deck, depending on the ship's original purpose. It's a low silencing cavern, crisscrossed with massive wooden beams that you'll definitely hit your head on later. A single, grimy lantern, swinging lazily from a central beam, does a poor job of illuminating the scene. It throws long, distorted shadows that writhe and dance with the motion of the ship, making the whole place feel alive and vaguely menacing. And it is packed. The space is filled with row upon row of canvas slings hanging from the beams, so close together they nearly touch. These are the hammocks. This is your deluxe accommodation. A man hands you a folded rectangle of stiff, coarse canvas and points vaguely toward a gap between two other snoring bodies. That's your spot. Your entire personal space for the foreseeable future measures about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. The hammocks themselves are a fantastic piece of naval technology. One of the few things on this ship that actually makes sense. Sailors in European navies originally slept on the hard, wet, and often rat-infested decks, which was as pleasant as it sounds. But then, on voyages to the Americas, they observed the Taino people of the Caribbean sleeping in woven cotton slings, suspended in the air. It was a revelation. Hammocks kept you off the disgusting floor, saved an immense amount of space, and swung with the motion of the ship, preventing you from being tossed out of bed in rough seas. So, you begin the awkward process of stringing up your new bed. The hooks are already screwed into the beams above. You hoist one end, then the other, your elbows bumping the sleeping men on either side of you. One of them groans and rolls over, his hammock swaying violently and bumping into yours, starting a chain reaction of gentle collisions down the line. A few mumbled curses echo in the dark. Getting into the hammock is an art form in itself. It's a tipsy, unstable canoe of canvas. You try to sit in the middle and swing your legs up, but you miscalculate, and the whole thing flits, dumping you unceremoniously onto the grimy deck. A few low chuckles ripple through the darkness. The veterans are amused. Your second attempt is more successful, and you finally settle into the belly of the sling. Now, you lie there, suspended in the dark. The constant, gentle rocking is, you have to admit, surprisingly soothing. It's a deep, rhythmic motion that feels like being in a cradle, but every other sense is on high alert. You are cocooned in the sounds and smells of the crew. A man to your left is snoring with a wet, gurgling sound, like a drowning badger. To your right, someone is coughing, a deep, chesty hack that sounds painful. You can hear men muttering in their sleep, whispering names of women or ports you've never heard of. Beneath it all is the constant symphony of the ship itself. The deep groan of the wooden hull, the creak of the masts, the gentle shush of the water sliding past just inches from your head. On the other side of the planking, and the routes, you can hear the faint, skittering sound of their claws on wood. This brings us to a question that maritime historians still ponder. Did these incredibly close quarters foster a unique sense of brotherhood? Or did they just create a powder keg of resentment? On one hand, this forced intimacy created a shared experience. Every man, regardless of his role on the ship, was in the same boat literally. They faced the same storms, ate the same weevil-infested biscuits, and slept in the same smelly, cramped space. This could have built a powerful sense of an us against the world camaraderie that was essential for a pirate crew's survival. On the other hand, imagine having absolutely no privacy. Never, no space to be alone with your thoughts. No escape from the man who snores, coughs, or just has a personality that grates on your every last nerve. It's an environment that could easily breed contempt and lead to the sudden, violent outbursts pirates were famous for. The line between a tight-knit crew and a floating prison was probably very thin indeed. You close your eyes, trying to block it all out. You can feel the rough canvas against your skin. The air is thick and humid, heavy with the moisture of shared breath. You try to find a comfortable position, but your neighbor's foot, dangling from his own hammock, is now resting gently against your shoulder. You give a little shove with your hand. He pulls his foot back with a sleepy grunt. This is your new reality. A constant, unavoidable, and slightly too personal dance with a dozen complete strangers. The initial shock is slowly giving way to a weary resignation. This isn't. This is home. And as the ship rocks you gently in its grimy embrace, you drift into a light, uneasy sleep. You awaken not to the gentle rays of dawn, but to a sudden, jarring thud against your hammock. Your eyes snap open. The single lantern is still burning, casting the same eerie shadows, but the air is now thick with the smell of smoke and frying fat. A man with a wooden leg, yes. A genuine, stereotypical wooden leg that clunks rhythmically on the deck is making his way through the narrow aisle, banging on hammocks with a short club. Rise and shine. Easy, dogs. Grubs on. He bellows, his voice like gravel in a barrel. This, you gather, is your alarm clock. It's effective, if a little aggressive. You swing your legs out of the hammock, this time with a bit more practiced grace, and your bare feet land on the cold, damp deck. A shiver runs up your spine. Around you, the crew is stirring. Men are groaning, stretching, and scratching. The scratching is vigorous and universal. Everyone seems to be doing it. They scratch their chests, their armpits, their beards, their shawls. It's like a silent, itchy symphony. You look down at your own arms and see a few small, red welts that weren't there last night. Ugh. The welcoming party has arrived. You follow the general flow of traffic up the ladder and onto the main deck. The sun is just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The sea air feels shockingly clean after a night marinating in the berth deck. For a moment, it's almost beautiful. Then your eyes land on the crew, now assembled in the daylight, and the illusion shatters. These are not the handsome rogues of fiction. This is a floating collection of the roughest men you've ever seen. Their hygiene, if you can even call it that, is a sight to behold. Most are barefoot, their feet calloused, cracked, and coated in a permanent layer of grime. Their clothes are a testament to their long journey at sea. Shirts and breeches are stained with tar, fish guts, rum, and who knows what else. The fabric is so stiff with salt and dirt that it probably could stand up on its own. A few men are missing eyes, covered with crude patches. Others have jagged scars bisect their faces. One man has a nose that looks like it was flattened in a bar fight and never quite set back into place. Their beards, which are almost universal, are not the well-groomed accessories you see in movies. They are wild, tangled messes, often with bits of yesterday's dinner still trapped within their depths. A convenient, if disgusting, snack for later, perhaps, and their teeth, or rather, the lack thereof, scurvy, bar fights, and a complete absence of dental care have taken their toll. Most men, when they smile or shout, reveal a collection of blackened stubs, wide gaps, and the occasional lonely, yellowed survivor. The smell of their breath, a potent mix of rot, stale rum, and infection, could probably stun a parrot at 10 paces. Here's a charming little fact. In an age before toothbrushes and toothpaste were common, people used what they had. A toothstick, basically a frayed twig, was sometimes used for scrubbing, but on a pirate ship, that was a luxury. More common was a rag dipped in salt water, if you bothered at all. Most didn't. The result was a constant state of low-grade dental agony for many. This leads us to a fascinating and still debated topic among historians: the diversity of a pirate crew. Were they all just desperate, outcast Europeans? Or were these ships some of the most multicultural places on Earth at the time? Evidence suggests the latter. A typical pirate crew was a surprisingly cosmopolitan mix. You'd find Englishmen, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, and Spaniards who had deserted or been captured. You'd also find a significant number of freed or escaped African slaves. For a man escaping the brutal reality of plantation slavery, a pirate ship, for all its horrors, offered a form of radical equality. On most pirate ships, black crew members had a vote, received an equal share of the loot, and could bear arms, rights that weren't thinkable on land. Some even rose to become powerful pirate captains, though this was rare. So, were pirates ahead of their time, creating a republic of the sea where race mattered less than your ability to fight? Or was it just brutal pragmatism again? They simply couldn't afford to be picky and needed every able body they could get. The debate continues, but it paints a far more complex picture than the standard narrative of a bunch of disgruntled British sailors. As you stand there, taking in this gallery of grizzled, unwashed humanity, you realize that you're going to be breathing the same air, eating from the same pots, and sleeping shoulder to shoulder with these men for months, possibly years. Their germs are now your germs. Their dirt is your dirt. The concept of personal space or cleanliness is a forgotten dream from another life. A man nearby hawks and spits a thick glob of phlegm onto the deck, narrowly missing your foot. He doesn't even notice. It's just part of the morning routine. You look down at your own relatively clean clothes and soft hands and realize you stick out like a sore thumb. To survive here, you can't just act like a pirate. You'll have to become one. And that process, you suspect, is going to involve getting very, very dirty. After the grim morning roll call, a pressing, Biological need begins to make itself known. You ate something last night, a greasy piece of salted fish and a hard biscuit, and your body is now ready to complete the digestive process. You discreetly look around for the facilities. Surely, a vessel holding 50 or 60 men has a designated spot for this. You skim the deck. There are coils of rope, stacks of barrels, cannons secured with thick tackle, but nothing that resembles a toilet, not even a crude outhouse. The other men don't seem concerned. They go about their morning tasks, swabbing the deck with seawater, of course, mending sails, or sharpening blades. You decide to ask someone. You approach one of the less intimidating-looking pirates, a lanky fellow who is meticulously checking the knot on a rigging line. "Excuse me," you begin, trying to sound casual. "Where is the head?" He looks up, confused for a moment. Then a slow grin spreads across his face. He points with his thumb towards the very front of the ship. "The bow. The heads are at the head," he says, as if it's the most obvious thing in the world, and chuckles to himself before turning back to his rope. You walk towards the front of the ship, a little confused by his circular answer. The head is the nautical term for the bow section. As you get closer, you understand. Protruding from the very front of the ship, out over the water, is a sort of grating or wooden framework. It's located just below the bowsprit, that long spar that juts out from the front of the vessel. This, you realize with a dawning sense of horror, is it? This is the toilet. There are no walls, no door, no roof. It is a completely open-air platform, exposed to the wind, the sea spray, and the judgmental eyes of every seabird in a 5-mile radius. The seats are just holes cut into the wooden planks, directly above the churning ocean. To use it, you have to clamber out from the main deck. Position yourself over one of the holes. Hold on for dear life to a nearby rope, and do your business. The name the head actually comes from this location, since the prevailing winds usually blew from the back of the ship the stern to the front the bow. Placing the toilets at the head of the ship was a surprisingly clever bit of natural ventilation design. The wind was supposed to carry the unpleasant smells away from the ship and the rest of the crew. Supposed to. You watch as another crew member makes his way out onto the grating. He expertly balances himself against the sway of the ship, braces his feet, and gets on with it. It's a precarious, public, and profoundly undignified process. The biggest problem, you quickly surmise, is when the ship is sailing into the wind, or when the wind is swirling unpredictably. In that case, the natural ventilation system works in reverse, giving everyone on the main deck an unwelcome preview of what their crewmate had for dinner. And then there's the sea spray. In rough weather, waves could crash over the bow, giving the person using the head an unexpected and forceful bite from below. It was both unsanitary and, frankly, dangerous. Losing your grip in a heavy swell could mean a one-way trip into the ocean, and the chances of the ship turning around for you were slim to none. This brings up a small, but fascinating, bit of shipboard life, the hierarchy of toilets. On large naval vessels, the common sailors used the heads at the bow. However, the captain often had a slightly more private, though not necessarily more sanitary, setup. His quarters were at the stern of the ship, and sometimes a small, enclosed wooden balcony would be built onto the side of his cabin, overhanging the water. This was the captain's private toilet. It offered a bit more dignity, but it also had its own problems. The waste would simply fall down the side of the ship, smearing along the hull. This is one of the reasons the rear of these ships, especially near the captain's quarters, was often notoriously foul. So while the captain enjoyed privacy, the people tasked with maintaining the hull did not. Historians are still piecing together the finer details of daily life on these ships, and sanitation is a big part of that puzzle. Was there a strict etiquette for using the head? Was there a queue? Did men get sick or injured from falling off? Ship logs and pirate trial records rarely mention such mundane and dignified details. They're full of accounts of battles, treasure, and mutinies. But the day-to-day reality of something as basic as going to the toilet is often lost to history. We have to infer a lot from the design of the ships themselves and from the broader naval practices of the time. We know the setup was primitive, but how the crew coped with it on a social level is something we can only guess at. You stand there, weighing your options. Your biological need is arguing with your sense of self, preservation, and dignity. The ship is rocking gently. The sun is climbing higher, and the crew is getting busier. You realize there is no other choice. This is not a system you can opt out of. With a deep sigh of resignation, you find a sturdy-looking rope. Check the wind direction with a wetted finger, and begin your awkward shuffle towards the head. You try not to make eye contact with anyone. This is just another small, daily humiliation that you have to accept as part of your new life. You just pray the wind stays in your favor. Having survived the perilous journey to the head, you return to the main deck feeling, well, you don't feel cleaner. That's for sure. You feel exposed and slightly damp from sea spray. As the day wears on and the Caribbean sun beats down, a new dimension of the ship's atmosphere begins to reveal itself. The general, ambient stink you noticed upon arrival was just the overture. Now, as the ship heats up, individual notes in that symphony of stench begin to blow, creating a rich and inescapable miasma. This isn't a smell you can simply get used to. It's an active presence. It seeps into your clothes, your hair, your skin, and even seems to flavor the back of your throat. Let's try to break it down, like a somewhere of suffering. The bass note, the foundation of it all, is the bilge, the lowest part of the ship's interior. The bilge is a dark, forgotten space where all the liquids on the ship eventually end up. Lakes, seawater, spilled rum, rainwater that found its way through a crack in the deck, vomit from seasick sailors, runoff from the livestock pens if the ship was lucky enough to have any, and general human waste that didn't quite make it over the side. It all trickles down into the bilge, forming a thick, black, sloshing soup. The smell it produces is a sulphurous, stomach-turning reek of pure decay. The ship's carpenter would periodically have to send someone down there a deeply unpleasant job to pump it out. But it was a losing battle. The bilge was always wet, and it always stank. On top of that foundation, you have the smell of unwashed bodies. We're talking about dozens of men, performing hard physical labor in a hot climate, with no access to fresh water for bathing. They sweat constantly. The sweat dries on their skin and clothes, mixes with the dirt and tar they work with, and then they sweat again the next day. This process repeats for weeks, sometimes months on end. Each man is cultivating his own unique ecosystem of bacteria, creating a pungent, sour, animalistic odor that surrounds him like an aura. When you pack all these men together below deck to sleep, their combined body odor creates a fog so thick you could practically swim in it. Then, there's the food, the salted meat, stored for months in barrels, has a sharp, rancid smell that catches in your nostrils. The drying fish, hanging from a line, adds its own distinct perfume. The ship's biscuits, though mostly odorless themselves, are often stored in barrels that have gone moldy or have been soaked in seawater, giving them a musty, damp basement scent. And let's not forget the sickness. In this environment, dysentery, typhus, and other gastrointestinal ailments were rampant. The smell of vomiting sickness was a constant and unwelcome companion, a reminder of the fragility of life on the high seas. Here's a little olfactory detail you might not appreciate. The smell of tar. Tar was essential for a wooden ship's survival. It was used to waterproof the hull, seal the decking, and protect the rigging ropes from the corrosive effects of salt and sun. The crew was constantly working with the stuff. It was heated in pots, creating a thick, acrid smoke, and then slathered onto every available surface. It got on their hands, their clothes, their tools. While the smell of hot tar can be nostalgic to some today, imagine it mixed with everything else. It was a sharp, chemical, industrial smell that clung to the ship, a constant reminder of the endless maintenance required to keep this floating piece of wood from falling apart. So, how did they stand it? This is a question that fascinates both historians and psychologists. Did pirates and sailors of this era simply have a different, much higher tolerance for what we would consider unbearable smells? There's a theory that in a world without modern sanitation where cities were filled with open sewers and garbage, people in general were or accustomed to strong, unpleasant odors. Their baseline for what constituted a bad smell was just set at a much higher level than ours. However, even by the standards of the 17th and 18th centuries, a ship at sea for a long voyage was considered exceptionally foul-smelling. Naval records and sailors' diaries, when they mention it, always describe the stench in grim terms. This suggests that they didn't get used to it. They just endured it. It was part of the misery of the job. The debate isn't whether it smelled bad, but rather how much this constant, oppressive sensory input affected the crew's morale and mental state. Did it contribute to the famous pirate rage and short tempers? Living in a permanent stink bomb would probably make anyone a little irritable. As you stand by the rail, trying to catch a breeze that doesn't smell like it's been filtered through a rotten saw, you watch the other men. They seem completely unfazed. They laugh, they work, they argue, all while breathing this air that feels like a physical assault to you. A man next to you is cleaning a fish, tossing the guts over the side. The blood and entrails leave a slight, glistening smear on the deck, and the coppery smell of it joins the chorus. You realize this isn't something you can fight. It's like the sun or the sea. It's just there. Your only hope is that one day, your sense of smell will simply give up in protest and shut down completely. Until then, you learn to breathe through your mouth and try to think of other things. A few days into your voyage, you notice that your clothes have absorbed the ship's signature. Scent and are now stiff with salt spray and accumulated grime. The desire for the simple comfort of clean fabric becomes an obsession. You see a few crew members gathered near the ship's rail, engaged in what looks like laundry day, pirate style. This, you think, is your chance to reclaim a small piece of civilization. You grab your spare shirt, the only other one you haven't joined them. The process is deceptively simple. A man has tied a strong rope to the corner of his shirt. He then tosses it over the side, into the ship's weight. He lets it drag behind the vessel for a few minutes, churning and tumbling in the turbulent water. Then, he hauls it back in. He wrings it out as best he can and hangs it on a rigging line to dry in the sun. It seems straightforward enough. Day 3. High-pressure wash cycle. Courtesy of the Atlantic Ocean. You find a spare bit of rope. Secure it to your own shirt and heave it overboard. You watch as it disappears into the foamy, churning water behind the ship. You feel a sense of accomplishment. You are adapting. You are taking initiative. You are doing pirate laundry. After what feels like a sufficient amount of time, you begin to haul the rope back in. It's heavier now. Waterline. With a final heave, you pull your shirt back onto the deck, and it is ruined. What you failed to appreciate is the sheer power and abrasion of this process. Dragging a piece of fabric through the water at several knots is like taking a belt sander to it. The threads are frayed, and a new hole has appeared near the collar. But the more immediate problem is the salt. You've just washed your shirt in the densest salt water imaginable. As it dries in the sun, the water evaporates, leaving behind a thick, crusty residue of sea salt. The fabric becomes stiff and abrasive, like sandpaper. Instead of being clean, your shirt is now a wearable skin irritant, guaranteed to cause chafing in places you didn't even know could chafe. You look at the other man's clean laundry, now hanging from the ropes. Their clothes look just as stiff and crusty as yours. They don't seem to mind. You realize the goal here wasn't cleanliness in the modern sense. It was about rinsing off the worst of the sweat and grime. The salt was just an accepted side effect. In fact, some might have even seen it as a benefit. The salt would have had a mild antiseptic effect and might have slowed the growth of mildew. A small comfort when your shirt is actively trying to scrub your skin off. This brings us to a weirdly specific but interesting detail of maritime life. Barnacles. Anything that spent a significant amount of time in the water would become a home for all sorts of marine life. This included the ship's hull, of course, but also anything you happened to be dragging behind it. If you left your laundry out for too long, you might pull it back and find a few tiny baby barnacles had decided to take up residence on your breeches. It's a uniquely nautical laundry problem. You wanted to leave it in long enough to get the dirt out, but not so long that it became a miniature reef. So, how did they deal with this? The historical record on pirate laundry techniques is, unsurprisingly, a little thin, but we can infer from general naval practice. This keel hauling of clothes was a common method. Despite its flaws, fresh water was far too precious to be wasted on washing. Every drop was for drinking. So, salt water it was. But what about soap? Soap existed in the 18th century, but it was a lye-based, harsh substance, usually made from animal fat and ash. It was a luxury item, and certainly not something a pirate crew would waste their limited cargo space on. So, no soap, just a salt water rinse and a sunbake. The ongoing debate here among historians of material culture is about the clothes themselves. What were pirate clothes actually made of? Forget the leather trousers and silk sashes of Hollywood. The average sailor's clothing was made from the most durable, practical fabrics available: canvas, wool, and linen. These materials were chosen for their toughness. A good pair of canvas breeches could stand up to the abuse of tar, salt water, and constant friction. Wool was valuable because it can keep you warm even when it's wet, a life-saving property on a cold night watch. But these tough fabrics also meant they were incredibly uncomfortable when new, and only became slightly less so with years of wear. The idea of soft or comfortable clothing was a foreign concept. The goal was durability. Full stop. When a shirt or a pair of trousers finally disintegrated from one too many salt water washes, you'd try to patch it with any scrap of fabric you could find, or hope you'd capture a ship with a cargo of clothes soon. You pick up your damp, salty, and now slightly more holy shirt. It smells different, not clean, but briny. It smells of the ocean, which is a marginal improvement over its previous bouquet. You hang it on a line and watch it flap in the wind, salt crystals glittering in the sun. You've just learned a valuable lesson. On this ship, better is a very relative term. You're not making things clean. You're just making them dirty in a different way. And as you feel the chafing from the still damp, salty clothes you're currently wearing. You make a mental note to just not wash your clothes again for a very long time. It seems easier. The fantasy of a pirate's life often includes a scene of the rugged hero, stripped to the waist, splashing his face with cool water from a barrel on deck. It looks refreshing, invigorating. The reality, you are learning, is a cruel joke. After a few weeks at sea, covered in a sticky film of sweat, soot, and grime, the idea of a bath becomes a desperate, maddening craving. You would trade a piece of your future treasure share for 5 minutes under a freshwater shower. But on this ship, fresh water is more valuable than gold. The ship's water supply is finite and precious. It's stored in a series of large wooden casks, or barrels, kept deep in the hold to keep them as cool as possible. This water was collected on land, often from rivers or streams that were not necessarily clean to begin with. From the moment it was sealed in the barrels, it began a slow process of decay. The wooden casks themselves would start to rot from the inside, tainting the water. Algae would bloom, turning the water a slimy green. Bacteria would multiply, creating a floating ecosystem of disease. After a few weeks at sea, opening a water cask was a gamble. The water that came out was often cloudy, foul, smelly, and had a distinctly swampy taste. This was your drinking water. The idea of using this precious, life-sustaining liquid to wash your body would be met with outrage, and possibly a fistfight. It was simply not an option. So, what were the alternatives? You were surrounded by an endless expanse of water. After all, why not just take a dip in the ocean? On a calm, hot day in the middle of nowhere, it seems tempting. A few of the bolder, or perhaps more foolish, crew members might do just that. They'd tie a rope around their waist and leap over the side for a quick plunge. It provided a moment of relief from the heat and rinsed off the top layer of filth, but it was incredibly risky. The ever-present danger of sharks was very real in these warm Caribbean waters. And even if no predators were around, the sea itself could be treacherous. A sudden swell could pull you under or slam you against the barnacle-encrusted hull of the ship, leaving you with a dozen nasty cuts that would almost certainly get infected. For most, the bath was a much less dramatic affair. It involved a bucket and a rope. You'd lower the bucket over the side, haul up some seawater, and give yourself a quick splash down on deck. This was the pirate's plunge bath. It did little more than move the dirt around and leave you coated in a fresh layer of salt, which, as you learned from your laundry experience, would soon become an itchy, crystalline crust on your skin. It was less about getting clean and more about a momentary psychological reset of brief, but shock to the system that made you feel slightly more human for a few minutes. This brings us to a rather disgusting but medically significant detail of life at sea: skin problems. The combination of constant wetness from sweat and salt water, the chafing of rough, salt-stiffened clothes, and the general filth created a perfect storm for a whole bestiary of skin ailments. Saltwater sores were a common complaint. These were painful, persistent boils and rashes that would erupt on the skin, particularly in areas where clothing rubbed, like the waist and neck. The constant dampness also encouraged fungal infections, like ringworm and something sailors called the HOBIA, an affectionate term for a fungal infection of the groin. It was an inescapable, itchy, and often painful reality of the job. Historians studying the daily lives of sailors often debate the psychological impact of this lack of cleanliness. It's easy for us to focus on the physical diseases, but what did it do to a person's sense of self-worth and dignity to be perpetually filthy? Some argue that it was part of a deliberate process of breaking down the individual in the rigid hierarchy of a naval vessel. Stripping away a man's ability to maintain personal cleanliness was another way of stripping away his identity, making him more compliant on a pirate ship. However, the dynamic was different. The filth was a great equalizer. The captain was likely just as grimy as the lowest cabin boy. Did this shared state of uncleanliness foster a unique kind of bond, a we're all in this sty together mentality? Or did it just contribute to a general sense of degradation and hopelessness that fueled the pirates' notoriously self-destructive behavior when they finally reached port? It's a difficult question to answer, as 18th century pirates weren't exactly known for keeping detailed emotional diaries. As the sun sets, you find yourself on deck during a rain squall, a sudden downpour of fresh water. You and half the crew instinctively stop what you're doing. You strip off your shirt, tilt your head back, and just let the rain wash over you. It's cold, but it's fresh. For a few glorious moments, you're rinsing away weeks of accumulated filth. Men are laughing, soaping themselves with their hands, using the deck as a giant shower floor. This is the closest you'll get to a real bath. It's a moment of pure, unexpected joy. But the squall passes as quickly as it came. The clouds part, and the moon appears. The moment is over. You're left standing on the deck, shivering undamp, but feeling marginally cleaner. It's a small victory in the ongoing war against the grime. And in this life, you learn to celebrate the small victories. The clanging of a metal spoon against a pot signals that it's time for the main meal of the day. Your stomach crumbles, a mix of genuine hunger and deep apprehension. Food on this ship is a functional affair, designed for longevity, not pleasure. The cornerstone of the pirate diet, the bedrock of your daily caloric intake, is a substance known as ship's biscuit, or hardtack. You're handed to dense, off-white squares that look more like ceramic tiles than food. You pick one up. It's surprisingly heavy and completely unyielding. You tap it against the wooden rail. It makes a sharp, solid clang. This is not the fluffy, buttery biscuit you might imagine. This is a simple, brutalized creation of flour, water, and sometimes a bit of salt. Bake 2, or even 4 times until it is utterly devoid of moisture. The result is a food product with the density of a brick-and-a-shelf life that could probably be measured in geological time. Properly stored, hardtack could remain technically edible for decades. This made it the perfect food for long sea voyages. You watch a veteran pirate across from you. He doesn't try to bite his hardtack directly. That's a rookie mistake. A good way to lose one of your few remaining teeth. Instead, he places the biscuit on the deck, raises his heavy boot, and brings it down with a sharp stalk. The biscuit shatters into a few smaller, more manageable, but equally hard pieces. This is step 1. Step 2 involves liquid. He drops a chunk into his cup of grog, the watered-down rum that is the crew's daily ration. He lets it sit for a few minutes, stirring it occasionally with his finger, until it soaks up the liquid and softens into a slightly more chewable, porridge-like sludge. This is how you eat hardtack. You follow his example. You break your biscuit apart using a nearby belaying pin instead of your shoe and drop the pieces into your own cup of water. As you stir the dissolving fragments, you notice a few small, black specks float to the surface. You'll deal with those later. The resulting mush is bland, tasty, and has the texture of wet sawdust. But it's filling. It's sustenance. You choke it down, trying not to think too much about the taste, or lack thereof. This brings us to a peculiar bit of hardtack lore. These biscuits were so notoriously hard that they found uses beyond simple nutrition. Sailors would write messages on them and varnish them as postcards to send home. They were carved into trinkets and game pieces. There are even accounts of them being used as projectiles in a pinch. An archaeological dig at a 19th century military fort uncovered a piece of hardtack that was being used as a backing plate for a door hinge. The stuff was, for all intents and purposes, a building material that you could also, theoretically, eat. The nutritional science behind the pirate diet, or lack thereof, is a topic of great interest to food historians. The core of their diet was this hardtack, supplemented with salted meat or fish. It was a diet incredibly high in salt and carbohydrates, but almost completely lacking in essential vitamins, particularly vitamin C. This was because they were ignorant of the importance of a varied diet. It was a matter of logistics. Fruits and vegetables would rot within days of leaving port. Grains like rice or oats were susceptible to mold and pests. Only the most durable, heavily preserved foodstuffs could survive a long voyage. This leads to a debate that still crops up. Did pirates eat better than sailors in the Royal Navy? The answer is a qualified sometimes. When pirates captured a prize ship, they would often feast for a few days on the fresh provisions they found on board. They deliberate the ship's chickens, pigs, and whatever fresh produce was available. They also plunder luxury goods like sugar, spices, and wine. So, for brief, glorious periods, their diet could be far superior and more varied than that of a naval sailor, who was stuck with the same monotonous, low-quality rations for months on end. However, these feasts were temporary. Between captures, their diet reverted to the same miserable baseline of hardtack and salted meat. The Navy, for all its faults, had a more reliable if unappetizing supply chain. A pirate's diet was a cycle of feast and famine. One week you're eating fresh beef and drinking fine Madeira. The next, you're back to gnawing on a rock-hard biscuit and hoping you don't break a tooth. It was this inconsistency, this lack of reliable access to fresh food, that made them so vulnerable to the nutritional diseases that plagued all sailors of the era. You finish your biscuits, lunch, and look at the second tile of hardtack still in your hand. You're not hungry enough to go through that process again right now. You see other pirates wrapping their leftover biscuits in scraps of cloth and tucking them away in their pockets for later. It's a snack on the go. You do the same, finding a small corner of your hammock to stash it in. As you do, you notice more of those little black specks on the surface of the biscuit. They look almost like pepper, but you know, with a sinking feeling in your gut, that this ship is definitely not provisioned with something as fancy as pepper. You decide not to look too closely. Some things are better left unexamined, especially when it's the only thing on the menu. You're sitting on the deck, contemplating your leftover piece of hardtack, when you see a fellow pirate, a grizzled old-timer with a beard like a tangled bird's nest, preparing his own. He doesn't stomp on it or immediately dunk it. Instead, he holds it over a dark-colored piece of cloth and gives it a few sharp taps with the handle of his knife. You watch, curious. A fungus falls from the biscuit onto the cloth, along with a number of small, wriggling, black-headed maggots and dark, beetle-like insects. He carefully brushes them off the cloth, then glances at the biscuit, seemingly satisfied, and pops a piece into his mouth. He gives you a knowing wink. Welcome to the hidden protein portion of your meal. The ship's biscuits were not packed in vacuum-sealed, pest-proof containers. They were stored in large, wooden barrels, which were often old, cracked, and far from airtight. These barrels were a paradise for insects. Flour weevils, a type of small beetle, would lay their eggs in the flour before it was even baked. The baking process wouldn't always kill all the eggs. As the biscuits sat in the hold for weeks and months, the eggs would hatch, and the larvae would begin to eat their starchy home from the inside out. By the time a barrel was opened mid-voyage, the biscuits were often more weevil than wheat. The sailors had many affectionate names for these unwelcome dining companions. They were called biscuit worms, shipmates, or the crew's little companions. Dealing with them was a daily ritual. The tap and brush method you just witnessed was the most common. In the dark, cramped conditions below deck, it was hard to see them, so sailors developed a preference for eating in the dark. The old sailor's adage was, "What the eye doesn't see, the stomach doesn't grieve." You just chewed quickly and tried not to think about the extra crunch. Some accounts even suggest that the weevils, when you got past the initial disgust, had a slightly nutty flavor. You'll take their word for it. The presence of these insects was so common, so utterly expected, that they were even factored into official naval supply contracts. The rules would sometimes specify an acceptable level of insect infestation. It was just a fact of life at sea. There's a rather grimly humorous piece of sailor's doggerel from the period that goes something like, "The worms have eat the biscuits, and the rats have eat the cheese. The purse RS sold the brandy. Oh, what will become of we?" It perfectly captures the resignation to their infested, poorly provisioned fate. This brings us to a slightly more scientific, and still debated, aspect of the pirate diet. From a modern nutritional perspective, the weevils and maggots were a bonus. It sounds disgusting, but these insects are pure protein. In a diet that was severely lacking in fresh protein and other nutrients, could these little critters have actually been beneficial? Some food historians and anthropologists argue that this accidental end to mop hagi, the practice of eating insects, might have provided a small but crucial nutritional boost, helping to stave off the worst effects of malnutrition for a little while longer. It's an unsettling thought, but it's possible that the most nutritious part of a ship's biscuit was the bugs living inside it. Other historians argue this is overstating the case, that the amount of protein gained would be minimal and the psychological cost of eating bug-infested food was the more significant factor. It likely did little to improve morale, even if it added a few milligrams of protein to the meal. Now, you have a choice to make. You look at your own piece of hardtack. You can see the tiny holes, the telltale signs of infestation. You can see a little brown head peeking out of one of them. Your modern sensibilities are screaming in protest. Your stomach is churning, but you are also hungry. And you know this is all you're likely to get for a while. You look around. No one else is batting an eye. This is normal. This is dinner. With a sigh that seems to carry all the weight of your lost illusions about the pirate's life, you find a dark corner of the deck. You hold the biscuit firmly. You close your eyes. You take a bite. It's hard. It's bland. And yes, there is a subtle, unidentifiable crunch that is not entirely from the biscuit itself. You chew quickly and swallow. You do not think about it. You are a pirate now, and pirates eat their weevils. It's a small, disgusting, but necessary step in your journey of survival. You tell yourself it's just extra protein. You tell yourself it's good for you. You try very hard to believe it. If the weevil-infested biscuits are the bread of your new life, then the main course is a pile of greasy, stringy meat that a crewman slops onto your wooden plate. It has a grayish-brown color and an overpoweringly salty, slightly rancid smell that manages to cut through even the thick ambient stench of the ship. This is salt pork, or sometimes salt beef, the other pillar of the long voyage diet. The process for creating this delicacy was simple. Take the cheapest, toughest cuts of meat, chop them into chunks, and bury them in a barrel with a massive amount of coarse salt. The salt would draw out the moisture, preserving the meat and preventing it from rotting, or at least slowing down the process significantly. These barrels would then be sealed and stored in the ship's hold for months, or even years, when it was time to cook. The ship's cook, who will meet in more detail later, would haul out a few chunks of this meat jerky. It was so saturated with salt that it was completely inedible in its raw, preserved state. To make it palatable, it first had to be soaked in a bucket of seawater for hours to draw out some of the excess salt. Of course, this meant rehydrating it with yet more salt water, a fundamentally flawed process that gives you an idea of the culinary thinking on board. After soaking, it would be boiled in a large cauldron, often with the broken-up hardtack, to create a sort of stew, affectionately known as lobscouse or just burgoo. This was the pinnacle of shipboard cuisine. You take a tentative bite of the meat. The first sensation is salt, an overwhelming, tongue-curling wave of pure salt. The second is the texture. It's incredibly tough and fibrous, like chewing on a piece of rope that has been soaked in brine. You have to gnaw and tear at it with your teeth, a process that feels more like demolition than dining. The flavor, what little there is underneath the salt, is vaguely of pork, but with a definite undertone of staleness and barrel wood. You look at the piece of meat on your plate. You can see the thick layer of yellowed fat clinging to it. And, in the dim light, the meat itself has a slightly iridescent sheen, a sign that it's been preserved for a very, very long time. Here's a delightful little tidbit about preserved meat at sea. Sometimes, the meat was so old and had been stored for so long that it would take on strange properties. There are accounts from sailors of salt beef that had been in its barrel for so many years that it had turned dark and hard. And when dry, it could be carved into little trinkets, much like the hardtack. They would make buttons or snuff boxes out of it. It's a testament to the sheer inedibility of the stuff that its best use was considered to be arts and crafts. Another common complaint was slump, the term for the thick, chili-like brine at the bottom of the barrel, a horrifying concentrate of salt, old meat juices, and rust. This was sometimes added to the stew for extra flavor. The historical debate around this food isn't about whether it was bad. Everyone agrees it was atrocious. The debate is about how it was managed and whether pirates had any advantages. On a Royal Navy ship, the rations were strictly controlled by the purser or pusser, an officer who was famously and often corruptly in charge of supplies. Pursers were known for acquiring the cheapest, lowest quality provisions to pocket the difference, and for using fraudulent measuring tools to shortchange the crew. The sailors' hatred for the purser was legendary. On a pirate ship, the system was different. The quartermaster, an officer elected by the crew, was in charge of distributing provisions. Because the quartermaster was one of their own and was accountable to the crew, it's argued that he would have distributed the food more fairly. Furthermore, when pirates captured a ship, they didn't just take the gold and silver. One of the most prized commodities was the food. They would plunder the captured ship's entire larder, often upgrading their own supplies. If the captured ship had better quality salt beef or fresher barrels, they would swap them out. This shopping by force meant that pirates, intermittently at least, had the chance to eat better preserved foods than their naval counterparts. They could be more discerning consumers, in a violent sort of way. So while their daily meal might be the same miserable stew, the ingredients going into it had the potential to be of a slightly higher, less ancient quality. You managed to swallow a few more bites of the salty meat, washing it down with your lukewarm, algae-tinged water. It's a meal that fills your stomach but offers zero pleasure. It's fuel, pure and simple. It makes you realize that on this vessel, eating isn't an experience to be savored. It's a chore to be completed, a necessary task to give you the energy to survive another day. You see a flash of movement out of the corner of your eye. A rat, sleek and bold, darts out from behind a barrel, snatches a dropped piece of fat from the deck, and disappears back into the shadows. At least someone on the ship is enjoying their dinner. After that incredibly salty meal, you are desperately thirsty. Your tongue feels like a dried sponge. You join the queue of men shuffling towards a lark. A bright barrel in the center of the deck. This is the scuttlebutt, the main source of drinking water for the day. A scuttled, but was simply a cask, but that had a whole scuttle drilled into it, so sailors could get their daily ration. It was the 18th century equivalent of the office water cooler, a place where the crew would gather, gossip, and complain. When it's your turn, the man in charge, the quartermaster's mate, ladles a cup of water from the barrel and hands it to you. You raise the tin cup to your lips, eager for relief. But before you drink, you look inside. The water is a murky, yellowish-green color. It's not clear. Floating on the surface are small, feathery green bits of algae and a few things that look suspiciously like insect larvae wiggling just below the surface. A faint, swampy odor of rotten stagnation rises from the cup. This is the water you are expected to drink to survive. You hesitate. The man behind you in line gives you a show. Drink up or move on. He grunts. Some of us are thirsty. You close your eyes, hold your nose, and take a large gulp. The taste is as bad as the smell. It's swarmy, with a flavor of wood, rust, and pond scum. It does nothing to quench your thirst. In fact, the foul taste seems to coat your mouth, making you feel even dirtier than before. You force yourself to swallow it, your stomach protesting. The journey of this water from a fresh stream to your cup is a story of slow, inevitable decay. The water was often collected hastily from questionable sources downstream from a settlement. For example, it was then sealed in wooden casks that were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned between uses. The wood itself would harbor bacteria and mold spores from previous voyages. Once at sea, stored in the warm, dark hold of the ship, the water became a perfect incubator. Algae bloomed, giving it the green color and slimy texture. Bacteria flourished. Insects that had been trapped in the barrel laid their eggs. The water didn't just go stale. It became a living soup of microorganisms. Sailors had various ways of trying to make it more palatable. Some would try to strain it through a piece of cloth to filter out the worst of the livestock, as they called the swimming larvae. Others would let it sit, hoping the solid bits would settle to the bottom. But nothing could remove the taste or the invisible bacteria. This water was a primary vector for diseases like dysentery, often called the bloody fluxion typhoid. A single contaminated water source could incapacitate an entire crew, a far greater threat than any naval warship. Here's a bizarre and little-known fact about shipboard water. Sometimes it would get better after getting worse. There's a phenomenon described in sailors' accounts where, after a period of being particularly foul and smelly, a process of intense bacterial fermentation, the water would sometimes clarify and lose its worst odor. The die-off of one set of microorganisms would lead to a temporary improvement in taste and smell. So a cask that was unbearable 1 week might be considered sweet the next. Of course, sweet was a very relative term, and the water was still teeming with invisible pathogens. This unpredictable cycle made choosing which cask to open next a constant gamble for the ship's officers. This state of affairs leads to a major historical discussion. Just how aware were they of the dangers? Did they connect the foul water with the rampant sickness? The full germ theory of disease was still more than a century away. They didn't understand bacteria or viruses. However, they were not fools. They made empirical connections. They knew that water from a clean, fast-moving mountain spring was better than water from a stagnant pond. They knew that sickness often followed the consumption of particularly bad-tasting water. They attributed the diseases to bad air or as arising from the foul water, which was incorrect in its mechanism but pointed them in the right direction. They understood the correlation, if not the causation. This is why captains and quartermasters on pirate ships, just like naval commanders, were obsessed with finding fresh water. A pirate's map was just about treasure. It was also a catalog of reliable, hidden coves with fresh springs. The need to resupply with water was a constant, driving force behind their movements. A long, unplanned period at sea without resupply didn't just mean they ran out of water. It meant the water they had became progressively more underkemble and more dangerous. A crew weakened by thirst and dysentery could not fight effectively. The scuttlebutt, therefore, was the true heart of the ship. Its contents, more than any treasure, dictated the crew's health, morale, and their chances of survival. You finish the last of the slimy water in your cup. Shuddering, you feel no more hydrated, just slightly more nauseous. You look at the other men, drinking their rations without a second thought. This is the price of freedom on the high seas. You can plunder Spanish gold, defy empires, and live by your own rules. But at the end of the day, you still have to line up and drink the green water. Your mouth still coated with the taste of swamp water. You watch as the quartermaster's mate moves to the next barrel. This one is smaller, more secure, and clearly holds something far more valuable than water. He unlocks a tap, and a rich, amber liquid pours into a measuring cup. An appreciative murmur runs through the assembled crew. This is the moment they've all been waiting for. The daily rum ration. He doesn't pour a full cup of pure rum for each man. Instead, he follows a now sacred ritual. He takes the ladle of foul, green water from the scuttle button, pours it into a large tub. Then, he adds a measure of rum. The resulting mixture is a brownish, murky concoction. This is grog. Each man steps forward to receive his share of this miraculous substance. You get your cup. The sharp, sweet, alcoholic smell of the rum almost, but not quite, overpowers the swampy odor of the water. You take a sip. It's transformative. The strong, fiery kick of the rum masks the slimy texture and foul taste of the water. The alcohol creates a warm, pleasant sensation that spreads through your chest. A stark contrast to the cold dread you felt drinking the water on its own. It's not delicious, by any stretch of the imagination. But it's drinkable, more than drinkable. It feels like a reward, a medicine, a small moment of joy in a day filled with misery. The invention of grog is a specific, well-documented historical event. It's credited to a British naval officer, Vice Admiral Edward Vernon. In 1740, Vernon was nicknamed Old Grog because he famously wore a cloak made of georugram cloth, a coarse blend of silk and wool. Before his time, sailors in the Royal Navy were given a daily ration of straight rum or brandy. This potent dose of alcohol on an empty stomach led to widespread drunkenness, brawls, and accidents. Vernon, in a moment of inspired pragmatism, ordered that the rum ration be diluted with water. The sailors, furious at having their beloved rum watered down, contemptuously named the new drink grog after the admiral they blamed for it. What started as a measure to improve discipline had an unintended, life-saving side effect. While Vernon didn't know about germ theory, the alcohol in the rum had an antiseptic effect. It killed some, they're not all of the bacteria, larvae, and other microscopic horrors lurking in the ship's water supply. It also, more importantly, made the foul water palatable enough that the men would actually drink it and stay hydrated. Pirates, who were often former naval sailors, quickly adopted the practice. It was just common sense. Grog made the undrinkable drinkable, and it provided a welcome buzz. This brings us to a weirdly specific cold knowledge about grog. The recipe. The official Royal Navy recipe was 1/4 of a pint of rum mixed with 1 full quart of water, served into portions daily. To this basic mixture, lemon or lime juice was often added. This was not for flavor. It was an early and crucial step in combating scurvy, a practice we'll explore later. Pirates, not being bound by official naval regulations, would have mixed their grog to their own tastes and available supplies. If rum was plentiful after capturing a prize, the grog would likely be much stronger. If supplies were dwindling, it would be weaker. The quartermaster controlled the rum, and the strength of the grog was a direct indicator of the crew's current fortunes. The historical debate here revolves around the role of alcohol in pirate life. Was the constant consumption of grog a simple necessity, a way to sterilize water and boost morale? Or was it a symptom of a deeper culture of alcoholism and self-destruction? The romantic image of the pirate is of a swaggering, perpetually drunk rogue. There's certainly truth to this. Accounts of pirates in port describe legendary benders, where men would drink themselves into a stupor for days on end, spending their hard-won loot on cheap rum. On board the ship, however, the picture is more complicated. Discipline had to be maintained. A crew of drunkards could not sail a ship, navigate through a storm, or fight effectively. The pirate codes often included strict rules against drunkenness during battle or while on watch. So, was the daily grog ration a controlled, functional habit, or the sign of a society teetering on the edge of chaos? The answer is likely both. It was a necessary tool for survival at sea that also fed into a culture where binge drinking was the primary form of recreation and release. You finish your cup of grog. The warmth in your belly is spreading to your limbs. The harsh edges of the day, the itchy clothes, the bad food, the constant stink seem to soften just a little. You feel a sense of camaraderie with the men around you, all of you sharing this daily ritual. The grog doesn't solve any of your problems. The water is still foul. The food is still bad. And the ship is still a floating suspect. But for a brief period, it makes it all seem a little more bearable. You now understand why the rum barrel is kept under lock and key, and why the daily ration is the most important event on the ship's calendar. It's not just a drink. It's a survival mechanism. The pleasant, warming buzz from the grog begins to fade, and as it does, another sensation comes into sharp focus. You are itching. It's not just a small, passing itch. It's a persistent, maddening, crawling sensation under your clothes, in your hair, and along the seams of your breeches. You scratch your arm, and your fingernails come away with a tiny, translucent white insect, no bigger than a sesame seed. This is a louse, and you are infested with them. You are not alone. You look around and see the other men casually scratching as they work. They scratch their chests, their beards, under their arms. It's a constant, unconscious gesture, as natural to them as breathing. This is not a temporary affliction. It's a permanent state of being. The ship is a paradise for parasites, and you are the main course. The cramped and gigantic conditions are a perfect breeding ground for body lice, which live and lay their eggs known as nits in the seams of clothing. with no way to properly wash clothes in hot water. Eradicating them was impossible. The population would just grow and grow, passing from man to man in the close quarters of the hammock deck. At night, it's even worse. As you lie in your hammock, the warmth of your body seems to activate them. You can feel them moving, 1,000 tiny footsteps on your skin. The itching can be so intense that it makes sleep nearly impossible. You scratch until your skin is raw and bleeding, which then opens you up to a whole new world of infections. The men have various folk remedies. Some would try to periodically smoke their clothes over a fire, hoping to kill the lice, a process that was risky on a wooden ship and only temporarily effective. The most common method of dealing with it was simply grim acceptance and a lot of scratching. But the lice are just the beginning of your parasitic adventure. The ship is also home to a thriving population of fleas. Unlike lice, which live on their host, fleas tend to live in the bedding in this case. The canvas of your hammock and any blankets you might have. They are tiny, athletic pests that can jump incredible distances. They deliver a sharp, painful bite that leaves a small, intensely itchy red well, often in clusters around the ankles and waist. So while the lice provide a constant, crawling itch, the fleas offer surprise attacks of sharp, stinging pain. It's a delightful combination. This brings us to a particularly charming piece of parasite-related trivia. Nitpicking, the term, which we now use to mean fussing over tiny, insignificant details, has a very literal origin. In an age when lice were ubiquitous, nitpicking was a common social activity. People would sit and meticulously pick the nits and adult lice out of each other's hair and clothing. It was a grooming behavior, not unlike what you see in primates, and it served a practical purpose. On a pirate ship, you might see the crewmen sitting on the deck in a quiet moment, one carefully examining the seams of the other's shirt, picking off the parasites. It was a sign of trust and camaraderie, a small act of mutual aid in the face of a shared misery. So, the next time you accuse someone of nitpicking, remember that you're referencing a very real and very itchy part of history. The historical debate here doesn't concern the existence of these pests they were given. The debate, especially in medical history, is about how much the pirates and sailors of the time understood the connection between these parasites and disease. We now know that body lice are the primary vectors for a deadly disease called epidemic typhus. But in the 18th century, the link wasn't so clear. They knew that ships with heavy lice infestations were often also ships struck by fever, but they attributed the disease to the foul air or general filth, not to the bite of the tiny insect. They saw the lice as a symptom of the sickness, not its cause. This failure to connect the dots had deadly consequences. They might try to combat the bad air by burning vinegar or tar, rituals that did nothing to stop the spread of the disease. The real cause, the louse, was simply seen as a disgusting but ultimately harmless nuisance. Was this pure ignorance? Or was it a case of them being on the right track but missing the final piece of the puzzle? Historians of science argue that this is a classic example of a pre-germ theory worldview. They were making observations and seeing patterns, but their underlying model of how disease worked was fundamentally flawed. They were trying to solve the right problem with the wrong science. You lie in your hammock, trying to find a position that minimizes the itching. You run your hand through your hair and feel the tiny, gritty nits clinging to the strands. You feel a flea bite your ankle and you slap at it in the dark. This is a war you cannot win. The parasites were here long before you, and they will be here long after you are gone. They are part of the ship's ecosystem, as much as the wood, the ropes, and the men themselves. Your body is no longer just your own. It is a shared territory. a walking buffet for a host of tiny, hungry creatures. And as you scratch and twitch in the darkness, you yearn for the simple, forgotten luxury of being alone in your own skin, just as you're drifting into an uneasy, edgy sleep. You're jolted awake by a frantic scrabbling sound inside the wall, just inches from your head. It's followed by a high-pitched squeak. You hold your breath and listen. A chorus of squeaks answers from the darkness of the hold below. It's the ship's other crew, the one that never sleeps and always outnumbers the men. The rats, if the lice and fleas are your intimate, personal tormentors. The rats are the ship's shadow government. They are everywhere. You see them as fleeting gray shapes in the corner of your eye, darting along the beams overhead or disappearing into the labyrinth of ropes and barrels. They are bold and intelligent. The ship's cat, a scrawny creature named Lucky, wages a valiant but ultimately futile war against them. For every rat she catches, 10 more seem to be born in the dark, warm recesses of the ship. These are not small field mice. These are ship rats. The notorious black rat Rattus rattus, large, cunning, and fiercely adaptable. They are masters of survival. They can chew through wooden barrels, take ropes, and even mother sails. Their primary target is the food supply. They infest the barrels of hardtack, leaving behind a trail of droppings and filth. They get into the sacks of grain, the stores of cheese, and any other edible item not sealed in metal. The sound of rats gnawing in the hold is a constant, unnerving soundtrack to life at sea, a reminder that you're precious. Limited food supply is being steadily depleted by an invisible army. The battle against the rats is relentless. Besides the ship's cat or terrier, which was also a popular choice for a rat-catching dog, the crew has other methods. They set crude traps, sometimes, in a fit of desperate sport. A group of men will corner off a section of the hull, armed with clubs and belaying pins, and conduct a rat hunt, a brutal and chaotic affair that probably does more to damage the ship's cargo than the rat population. But the rats always win. Their ability to breed is astonishing. A single pair of rats can produce hundreds of offspring in a year. On a long voyage, the rat population could explode, reaching plague-like proportions. This brings us to a rather grim but resourceful piece of nautical lore. When things got really bad, sailors ate the rats. In times of starvation, when the hardtack was gone and the salt meat barrels were empty, rats became a vital source of protein. Desperate crews would hunt them, skin them, and boil them in a stew. By all accounts, they tasted not great, but in a choice between eating a rat and starving to death, the rats usually won. This grim reality is a stark contrast to the romantic image of the feasting pirate. The truth is that starvation was a constant threat, and the line between hunter and hunted could become very blurry. The historical debate surrounding the rats is a big one, because it's not just about lost food. Ship rats are infamous in history for one primary reason. They carry fleas, and those fleas can carry the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of bubonic plague. While the Great Black Death of the 14th century was in the past, smaller outbreaks of plague continued to pop up around the world well into the 19th century, often transported by ships. So, the question historians and epidemiologists grapple with is, how significant a role did pirate ships play in the transmission of diseases like the plague? On one hand, pirate ships were perfect vectors. They were heavily infested with rats and operated outside of official channels, meaning they were subject to the quarantine laws that port authorities were beginning to implement. A pirate ship could pull into a secluded cove, interact with a local population, and potentially introduce a devastating disease without anyone in the official world knowing. On the other hand, the lifespan of a pirate ship and its crew was often short. They were sunk, captured, or wrecked frequently. This might have limited their ability to act as long-term intercontinental disease vectors in the same way that established merchant fleets did. Were they a major public health menace, or a relatively minor, chaotic factor in the global spread of disease? The evidence is scarce, as pirate activities were, by their nature, poorly documented, but the potential was certainly there. Every time a pirate ship dropped anchor, it was just men in cannons coming ashore. It was a whole ecosystem of pathogens and pests. You lie in your hammock, listening to the skittering and squeaking in the walls. You think about the hardtack you ate earlier, the biscuit that has been stored in a barrel in the hold, a space completely controlled by the rats. You think about their droppings, their hair, their filth, all mixed in with your food. You think about the fleas they carry. A shiver runs down your spine that has nothing to do with the cold. The lice and fleas that live on you are bad enough, but the rats represent a different level of filth, a deeper, more insidious contamination. They are a sign that the ship itself is sick, and you are living inside the diseased beast. The gentle rocking of the hammock no longer feels comforting. It feels like you're being rocked in the belly of a tomb. It starts subtly. You've been at sea for over a month now, and you just feel tired. Not the normal physical exhaustion from a hard day's work, hauling ropes and climbing rigging. This is a deeper, more profound weariness, a heavy lethargy that settles into your bones. Your muscles ache, and you feel irritable and weak. You chalk it up to the bad food, the poor sleep, the constant stress. Everyone else seems to be feeling it too. Tempers are shorter, and arguments break out over the smallest things. Then, other symptoms begin to appear. You notice your gums feel swollen and tender. When you chew on your hardtack sludge, there's a dull, throbbing pain. One morning, you run your tongue over your teeth and notice your gums are spongy and bleed easily. You look at them in a small, cracked piece of mirror you have. They are a dark, purplish-red color, angry and inflamed. This is not a simple toothache. This is the beginning of scurvy, the scourge of the sea. As it was known, was the single greatest killer of sailors in the age of sail, responsible for more deaths than naval battles, storms, and piracy combined. It was a slow, agonizing, and mysterious disease, and you are now experiencing its opening act. Scurvy is the result of a severe deficiency of vitamin C ascorbic acid. The human body cannot produce or store vitamin C, so we need a constant supply from our diet. It's essential for the production of Colin, a protein that acts like the glue holding our bodies together. It's vital for skin, blood vessels, bones, and cartilage. When you are deprived of vitamin C for a long period, as you have been on your diet of hardtack and salt, meat, your body's collagen production grinds to a halt, and things start to fall apart. The first signs are the fatigue and the swollen, bleeding gums. But that's just the prelude. As the disease progresses, its effects become more widespread and more terrifying. Small, dark spots, caused by bleeding under the skin, will begin to appear on your legs and arms. Your joints will swell and ache, making every movement an agony. Your breath will become horrifically foul. Here's a particularly strange and disturbing fact about scurvy. It makes your body forget how to heal, because collagen is essential for wound repair. Even the smallest cut or scratch will fail to heal properly. It will remain an open sore, prone to infection. But the most bizarre and psychologically terrifying symptom is that old, previously healed wounds can spontaneously reopen. A scar from a sword cut you got years ago could suddenly break apart, the skin splitting open as if the injury just happened. Old bone fractures could come apart. It is as if the disease is literally deconstructing your body, reversing your personal history of healing, one injury at a time. The historical mystery of scurvy is not that it existed, but why it took so long to definitively conquer. The cure was known, lured, and rediscovered multiple times over the centuries. As early as the 1592s, the English naval commander Sir Richard Hawkins noted that citrus fruits, specifically oranges and lemons, were a miraculous cure for the disease. In 1617, the physician John Woodard, working for the East India Company, explicitly recommended lemon juice for surgeons' kits. And yet, this knowledge was repeatedly forgotten or ignored by the naval establishments. The debate among historians is, why? Why did it take until James Linn's famous experiment in 1747, where he systematically tested different potential cures on score but I see sailors and proved that citrus was the answer for the medical community to start taking it seriously? And even then, it took the British Royal Navy another 50 years to make lemon or lime juice a standard issue ration. Part of the problem was a lack of a coherent theory of disease. Without understanding vitamins, doctors proposed all sorts of incorrect causes for scurvy: bad air, laziness, salt water, cold. Others championed ineffective cures like sulfuric acid or vinegar. There was also a logistical problem. Preserving fruit or its juice on a long voyage was difficult and expensive. It was easier and cheaper to load up on hardtack and hope for the best. Were the authorities incompetent, cheap, or just blinded by incorrect scientific theories? The answer is likely a frustrating mix of all three. Pirates, operating outside this bureaucracy, might have informally understood the value of fresh fruit, feasting on it whenever they made landfall, but they lacked a system to preserve and ration it effectively for long voyages. You look around at your crewmates. You see the signs in them too. The sallow skin, the sunken eyes, the way they move stiffly, as if in constant pain. A man next to you smiles, and you can see the dark, swollen state of his gums. HES in the same boat as you, slowly coming apart from the inside out. The ship, which once seemed like a place of grim adventure, now feels like a floating infirmary, a laboratory for a horrific experiment in nutritional deficiency. You are not just fighting the sea, the enemy, or the parasites anymore. You are now fighting your own body as it begins to betray you. And the worst part is, you know it's only going to get worse. The days bleed into one another in a haze of pain and exhaustion. The scurvy is no longer a subtle malaise. It is a full-blown assault on your body. Your legs are now covered in dark, blotchy bruises, and your joints have swollen to the point where climbing the rigging is an exercise in pure agony. Every step ends a shooting pain through your knees and ankles. You spend most of your time now doing simple, seated tasks, mending a sail, coiling a rope, anything that doesn't require you to move much. The situation with your mal has escalated from unpleasant to horrific. Your gums are so swollen and putrid that they have begun to grow over your teeth, which are now loose in their sockets. Eating is a nightmare. The hardtack sludge, once merely bland, is now a source of excruciating pain as it rubs against your raw, bleeding gums. You can feel your teeth shift and wobble when you talk or try to chew. One afternoon, while gnawing on a piece of salt beef, you feel a sudden, sickening give. You spit into your hand and stare in horror at the bloody molar lying in your paw. It didn't break. It just fell out. The collagen framework holding it in your jaw has simply dissolved. you see the same thing happening to the men around you. They have become gaunt and hollow-eyed. Their skin is pale, sickly yellow. They move like old men. The ship is filled with the stench of their foul breath. A uniquely horrible smell of decaying known as score, but icy breath. Men are losing teeth daily. Some try to hide it, ashamed of the gaps in their mouths. Others display it with a kind of grim, fatalistic humor. This is when you witness the most terrifying symptom of advanced scurvy, the one that seems to defy all logic. An old pirate named Finn, a man covered in the faded scars of 100 brawls, is sitting on the deck, his leg propped up. A long, thin scar runs down his shin, a memento from a boarding action years ago. It had been healed for a decade, but now you watch as a dark, purplish line appears along the scar tissue. Over the next few days, it widens, and the skin begins to separate, puckering and pulling apart. The old wound is literally reopening, splitting open as if the blade had just struck him, revealing the rough flesh beneath. There is no new injury, no infection. His body is simply unhealing itself. It's a sight so unnatural, it makes you feel physically ill. This phenomenon of old wounds reopening was well documented, but completely baffling to the physicians of the time. It seemed like a form of black magic, a curse that made a man's past injuries come back to haunt him. We now know it's a direct and logical consequence of collagen collapse. Collagen is the scar tissue, the speckle that patches up our bodies when the body can no longer produce it. The oldest, weakest patches are the first to give way. This is a cold, hard fact of biology. But to the men on this ship, it must have felt like a supernatural horror. The historical debate here centers on the psychological impact of these extreme symptoms. We can read the clinical descriptions in old medical texts, but what did it feel like to experience this? To have your teeth fall out, your bones ache, and your old scars tear themselves open. Some historians argue that this physical decay led to a state of profound depression and hopelessness, a scorbut icy apathy that made men simply give up and wait for death. It would explain the lethargy and irritability that were the first signs of the disease. Others suggest that for pirates, this shared, horrific experience might have fostered a unique, if grim, form of bonding, when every man on board is literally falling apart in the same way. It erases hierarchies and creates a community of suffering. The captain and quartermaster are now desperately searching the horizon for any sign of land. Any island, no matter how small or barren, might have something green on it. A bit of wild celery, some scurvy grass, a coastal plant aptly named for its curative properties. Even certain types of seaweed could provide the tiny amount of vitamin C needed to halt the disease's progress. The fate of the entire crew now depends not on finding treasure, but on finding a patch of weeds. You lie in your hammock, too weak to move much. You gingerly probe the empty socket in your gum with your tongue. The pain is a constant companion. You look at your hands, at the faint white line of a scar on your knuckle from a childhood accident. You watch it, waiting, terrified that it too will begin to unwind. The ship is no longer an adventuring vessel. It has become a death ship, haunted by the ghosts of old wounds, carrying a crew of men who are slowly, inexorably, coming undone. The race is on. Find land and the cure, or drift until everyone on board has been deconstructed by this insidious disease, their bodies simply falling to pieces, as if the slow, internal decay of scurvy was enough. A new terror begins to sweep through the ship. It starts with a man named Thomas, one of the younger sailors. He develops a high fever, his body racked with shivers despite the Caribbean heat. He complains of a blinding headache and severe back pain. Within a few days, a strange, Blotchy red rash appears on his chest and abdomen, quickly spreading to the rest of his body. He becomes delirious, muttering nonsense and thrashing in his hammock. He is burning with a fever you can feel just by standing near him. The other crew members give his hammock a wide berth. They whisper in hushed, fearful tones. They've seen this before. They call it ship fever, jail fever, or camp fever. We know it today as epidemic typhus, and it is a swift, undeficient killer. Unlike the slow-motion horror of scurvy, typhus is a wildfire. The disease is caused by a bacterium called Rickettsia proaguesci, and its vector is the creature you have come to know so intimately, the body louse. The louse ingests the bacteria when it feeds on the blood of an infected person. The bacteria then multiply and the low uses gutted are excreted in its feces. When an infested person scratches their itchy bites, they create tiny abrasions in their skin. It's through these scratches that the infected louse feces enter the bloodstream. The very act of scratching, your only defense against the maddening itch, is what seals your fate. The disease spreads with terrifying speed in the cramped, lice-infested conditions of the birth deck. The lice, happy to travel, move from one warm body to the next, from one hammock to the other, carrying their deadly cargo. Within a week, a dozen more men are struck down with the same symptoms: high fever, debilitating headache, the telltale rash, and delirium. The already grim atmosphere on the ship turns to one of outright panic. Scurvy was a predictable decay. This is a sudden, raging plague. There is no cure. There is no treatment. The men can only watch as their crewmates either succumb to the fever, in rare cases, survive it. Those who die often perish from pneumonia, gangrene, or simple dehydration and exhaustion from the high fever. The ship's surgeon, a man well get to know better soon, is helpless. He can offer sips of water and a comforting word, but he has no medicine that can touch this. This brings us to a grim but practical piece of information regarding disease at sea: the mortality rate for typhus in the conditions of an 18th century ship. The death rate could be staggering, ranging from 10% to as high as 60% of the crew. A typhus outbreak could cripple a ship more effectively than a broadside from a naval frigate. A crew of 60 men could be reduced to a skeleton crew of 20 in a matter of weeks, leaving them unable to properly sail the ship, let alone fight. The historical debate around typhus focuses on its impact on naval power and, by extension, piracy. Some military historians argue that typhus, not cannonballs, was the true deciding factor in many naval campaigns of the era. A fleet could be rendered combat ineffective before it even saw the enemy, simply by an outbreak of ship fever picked up in a crowded port. For pirates, the threat was even more acute. They often recruited men from jails or press, gauged them from captured ships, both prime environments for lice and typhus. A new recruit could bring the disease aboard and wipe out half the crew. So, how did they perceive this invisible threat? Again, without germ theory, their understanding was flawed but based on observation. They knew the disease was contagious, that it flourished in crowded, filthy places like prisons and ships. They called it jail fever for a reason. They associated it with filth and vermin, even if they didn't understand the specific role of the louse. This is why a captain, if he had the choice, would be very wary of taking on new crew from a source known to be unhealthy. It was just about the man's skills. It was about the invisible pathogens he might be carrying. The health of a potential prize ship's crew was also a major factor. A ship known to be a fever ship might be plundered for its cargo, but its crew would be avoided at all costs. You try to stay as far away from the sick bay now just a quarantine corner of the stinking berth deck as possible. But on a ship this small, there is no escape. You hear the delirious cries of the sick, the groans of the dying. Every morning, the crew must perform the grim ritual of sewing the body of another fallen comrade into his own hammock, with a cannonball at his feet for weight, and sliding him over the side into the sea. There is a brief, mumbled prayer, and then it's over. Another one gone. You scratch an itch on your neck and freeze, a cold knot of fear tightening in your stomach. Was that just an itch? Or was it the bite that will condemn you to the fever? You are trapped on a floating petri dish, surrounded by enemies you can see and a million more that you can't. The trifecta of misery is now complete. You are being eaten from the inside out by scurvy, hunted by the typhus fever, and now your very skin is in open rebellion. The constant dampness, the chafing of your salt-stiffened clothes, and the general layer of filth you live in has created the perfect environment for a whole atlas of dermatological nightmares. You look down at your hands. The knuckles are cracked and bleeding. Between your fingers, a red, itchy rash is spreading. It might be scabies, caused by a microscopic mite that burrows under the skin to lay its eggs, creating an unbearable itch that gets worse at night. Or it could be a fungal infection, thriving in the perpetual moisture. It's impossible to know. Your feet are in even worse shape. They are almost never dry. They are constantly steeping in a soup of sweat inside your leather shoes, if you have them, or being splashed with bilge water and seawater on deck. The skin is pale, wrinkled, and soft, like you've been in a bathtub for a month. This is the beginning of a condition known as trench foot, or, in this context, immersion foot. The constant wetness damages the skin, nerves, and muscles. Your feet are numb, yet they also ache with a deep, throbbing pain. Small blisters are forming, and you know that if they break, they will become open sores, perfect entry points for infection, around your waist, where the rough canvas of your breeches rubs against your skin. A ring of angry red boils has appeared. These are the infamous salt water sores you heard about. They are a form of folliculitis, an infection of the hair follicles, aggravated by friction and the filthy conditions. They are painful to the touch and sometimes leak a foul-smelling pus. Every movement is a fresh reminder of their presence. And then there are the less specific, but equally unpleasant, rashes, patches of eczema, hives from mysterious allergies, and the general, all-over redness and irritation that comes from being constantly dirty and bitten by fleas. Your skin, your body's first line of defense against the outside world, has been breached. It is no longer a protective barrier, but a roadmap of your suffering, a canvas displaying the various miseries of life at sea. Here's a particularly unpleasant detail about skin care in the 18th century. One of the few remedies available for skin complaints was a mercury-based ointment. Mercury was a common ingredient in medicine at the time, used to treat everything from syphilis to skin rashes. While it had some antiseptic properties, it was also, of course, a potent neurotoxin. So, a pirate trying to treat his painful boils might slather himself in a mercury salve. It might temporarily soothe the skin, but over the long term, he was slowly poisoning himself, leading to tremors, memory loss, and kidney failure. It was a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. The historical debate among medical historians here is about the prevalence and impact of these minor afflictions. Scurvy and typhus were the big killers, the headline acts of maritime disease. But did the constant, grinding misery of these skin conditions have a more significant impact on a crew's day-to-day effectiveness and morale than is oft unacknowledged? A man suffering from the agonizing itch of scabies or the pain of saltwater sores might not be able to focus on his duties. He might be clumsy, irritable, and slow. When an entire crew is suffering from these ailments, it could lead to a significant degradation of their collective ability to sail and fight. These weren't life-threatening diseases in themselves, but they created a baseline of constant pain and destruction. They were a death by 1,000 cuts, or in this case, 1,000 itches, boils, and rashes. Furthermore, every one of these breaks in the skin was a potential gateway for a much more serious bacterial infection like cellulite or gangrene, which could absolutely be fatal. You watch as a man carefully lances one of his own boils with the tip of his knife, the same knife he uses to cut his food. He winces as a thick, yellow fluid erupts, and he wipes it away with a dirty rag. He doesn't clean the wound. He doesn't bandage it. He just pulls his shirt back down over it and goes back to work. This is the standard of medical care you practice on yourself. It's a miracle that anyone survives. You look at your own ravaged skin. You feel like you are dissolving. Your body's integrity failing on every level. Your gums are rotting. Your joints are failing. Your blood is poisoned with fever. And now your skin is erupting in a painful, itchy protest. The romantic image of the pirate is one of a scarred but ruggedly healthy warrior. The reality is this: a creature of constant, low-grade agony, whose body is a battlefield for a dozen different kinds of decay. You are no longer a man. You are a walking ecosystem of disease, a floating island of filth in a vast, indifferent ocean, and you wonder, how much more can a body take before it simply gives up? A scream of pure agony cuts through the air from the foredeck, followed by a sickening crunch. A young sailor, his attention wandering due to feverish exhaustion, got his hand caught in the mechanism of the ship's anchor windlass. The crew rushes over. His hand is a mangled mess of broken bones and torn flesh. He is pale with shock, blood pouring onto the deck. Get the surgeon. Someone yells. All eyes turn to a man named Silas. Silas is not a doctor. He has no medical training, no degree from a university. Up until last week, his primary job was the ship's carpenter. He was a man who fixed broken masts and patched holes in the hull. But the ship's previous surgeon, who was actually the cook, died of typhus a few days ago. Silas was chosen as his replacement because he was good with a saw and was considered to have a strong stomach. This is your new head of medical services. The role of the surgeon on a pirate ship was a position filled by necessity, not qualification. On a large naval vessel, there would be a trained sergeant, a man who had at least completed an apprenticeship and passed an exam. He would have some knowledge of anatomy and medicine, however flawed by the standards of the time. On a pirate ship, you were lucky if you had someone who had once been a surgeon's mate in the Navy. More often than not, the job fell to the man who was most willing to do it, or the man who had the most relevant, if tangential, skills. The carpenter was a common choice because he had the essential tools: saws, chisels, and drills. He understood leverage and construction, which, in a gruesome way, was relevant to setting a broken bone or performing an amputation. The cook was another frequent candidate, because he knew how to butcher meat. The logic was grimly simple. If you can carve up a pig, you can probably carve up a man. These surgeons were not healers. They were battlefield butchers, whose main job was to patch up traumatic injuries long enough for the person to either survive or die. Silas, the carpenter turned surgeon, approaches the injured man. His face is grim. He doesn't have a white coat or a sterile office. His surgery is the open deck, surrounded by gawking, anxious crewmen. He calls for his tools. Someone brings him the carpenter's toolbox. the same one he uses to fix the ship. He also calls for the two most important items in the pirate medical cabinet: a bottle of rum and a pot of tar from the ship's stores. This brings us to a fascinating and often misunderstood part of pirate lore: the compensation for injuries. The pirate code, the articles that every crewman signed, didn't just lay out the rules for sharing loot. It was also a form of workman's compensation. It would list specific payments for specific injuries sustained in the line of duty. For example, the loss of a right arm might be worth 600 pieces of 8. A left arm, slightly less, at 500. A lost eye or a finger might be worth 100. These payments would be given to the injured man from the ship's treasury before the rest of the loot was divided among the crew. This system was remarkably progressive for its time. In the Royal Navy, a man who lost a limb might get a small pension or a place in a charity hospital if he was very lucky. More often, he'd be left to beg on the streets. The pirate code, for all its brutality, offered a safety net. The historical debate here is about the motivation behind this system. Was it a sign of a surprisingly enlightened and compassionate social structure, a brotherhood that looked after its own? Or was it, once again, pure pragmatism? A man is much more likely to fight bravely, to be the first one to board an enemy ship, if he knows that a debilitating injury won't leave him destitute. The compensation scheme was a powerful incentive for bravery. It turned a potential personal disaster into a guaranteed payday. The debate isn't whether the system existed, it's well documented, but whether its roots were in solidarity or in cold, hard, economic calculation. Silas kneels beside the injured sailor. He takes a long swig of rum himself, then hands the bottle to his patient. "Drink," he says. "All of it." The young man, trembling with pain and fear, chugs the raw spirit. This is the only anesthetic available. There is no ether, no morphine. There is only the hope of drinking yourself into a state of stupor so profound that you might not feel the full horror of what is to come. Silas lays the man's arm on a wooden block, looks at the mangled hand, and then looks at his saw. He shakes his head. The hand is too far gone. It will have to come off. He takes another deep breath to steady his nerves. He is a carpenter, and he has a job to do. Silas, the carpenter surgeon, wipes his hands on his breeches and opens his toolbox. The sight of its contents is enough to make a healthy man faint. This is not a sterile, stainless steel kit of precision instruments. This is a collection of rough, iron tools, stained with rust and wood resin, that have been repurposed for human bodies. First, there is the saw. It's a small, horse-tooth amputation saw, not much different from the one he uses to cut planks of wood. Its primary feature is its ability to get through bone quickly, not cleanly. Next to it are several large, sharp knives of various shapes, more akin to butcher's knives than scalpels. They are for cutting through skin, muscle, and sinew. There are heavy iron probes for exploring wounds, looking for musket balls or splinters, and a frightening-looking pair of pliers for extracting them, or for pulling teeth. He lays out a few other key items. A set of large, curved needles and some thick, wax thread, the same kind used to stitch canvas sails, for sewing up large wounds. There is no concept of fine, delicate stitches here. The goal is simply to pull the skin together, like lacing up a boot. He also has a tourniquet, a simple leather strap with a wooden handle to twist it tight, designed to cut off blood flow to the limb being operated on. And finally, there's a small, iron brazier, already glowing with hot coals, with a pot of black, bubbling tar heating over it. This grim collection of tools was standard for the age, even for many trained naval surgeons. The understanding of surgery was mechanical, not biological, and our moral leg was a piece of organic machinery that needed to be repaired or, more often, removed. The tools reflected this philosophy. They were built for heavy duty, brute force work. A particularly horrifying piece of kit that you might find in a surgeon's chest from this era is a tool called a trapen. It was essentially a hand-cranked drill used for boring holes into a patient's skull. This procedure, called trepanning, was an ancient practice used to relieve pressure on the brain from a head injury, or sometimes to release evil spirits. For a pirate who took a blow to the head from a belaying pin, a well-meaning but ill-informed surgeon might decide to drill a hole in his skull to let the badness out. The chances of surviving such a procedure, with no anestheticant, no understanding of sterile technique, were slim to none. The historical debate among medical historians is about the relative skill of these impromptu surgeons. Were they all just clumsy butchers, as the stereotype suggests, or did some of them, through sheer repetition and experience, become surprisingly adept at their grisly trade? An experienced pirate surgeon like Silas might have performed dozens of amputations in his career. He would have seen, through brutal trial and error, what worked and what didn't. He would know exactly where to apply the tourniquet, how quickly to saw through the bone to minimize shock, and how to tie off the main arteries to prevent the patient from bleeding out. Some historians argue that a seasoned pirate surgeon, while lacking formal knowledge, might have been a more practical undefective trauma surgeon than a university-trained doctor on land who had never seen a cannonball wound. The pirate surgeon's entire practice was focused on one thing: dealing with the extreme trauma of combat. He was a specialist in a very narrow and gruesome field. The counter-argument, of course, is that without any understanding of infection or anatomy beyond the very basics, even the most practiced hand was still operating in the dark. His success was based on luck and the patient's constitution as much as on his own skill. Silas is everything laid out. The injured man is now either unconscious from the rum or has simply fainted from fear and pain. For the strongest crew members are called over. Their job is to hold the patient down. Even an unconscious man can thrash violently when the saw hits the bone. It's a grim, necessary precaution. Silas checks the tourniquet, making sure it's brutally tight. He picks up one of the large knives. He takes a deep breath, lets it out slowly, and makes the first cut. You stand there, frozen, watching this nightmare unfold on the deck. The ship rocks gently on the waves. The sun is warm on your back. A seabird cries in the distance. The ordinary, everyday sounds of the sea are a bizarre and surreal backdrop to the scene of methodical, bloody butchery happening just a few feet away. This is the reality of pirate medicine. It's not about healing. It's about salvage. It's about cutting away the ruined parts of a man to save what's left. And it is a brutal, terrifying, and unforgettable spectacle. The scene on the deck has devolved into a controlled, horrific chaos. The young sailor, despite the copious amount of rum he consumed, is not unconscious. As Silas's knife slices through his skin and muscle, his eyes fly open, and he lets out a sound that is not quite a scream, but a deep, guttural roar of pure animal agony. The four men holding him down strain with all their might, their knuckles white, their faces grimly set. The sailor's body arches and thrashes against their grip, a desperate, instinctual attempt to escape the unbearable pain. There is no concept of anesthesia as we know it. The rum was not meant to numb the pain completely. It was meant to dull the senses, to induce a state of shock and disorientation that might, with luck, lead to unconsciousness. Sometimes it worked. Often, it didn't. Patients were frequently awake for the entire gruesome procedure, fully aware of every cut, every saw stroke, every shattered piece of bone. The only mercy was that the shock and blood loss would sometimes cause them to faint part way through. Silas works with a grim, focused speed. He ignores the screams. He has to. He cuts in a circular motion around the forearm, just below the elbow, creating a flap of skin. He pushes the skin back, exposing the bone. Then he picks up the saw. The sound is the most sickening thing you have ever heard. It's a wet, grating, crunching sound as the coarse teeth tear through bone and marrow. It is a sound that will stay with you, in your nightmares, for the rest of your life. The sailor thrashes so violently that one of the men holding his leg loses his grip for a second. The screams have dissolved into a hoarse, rhythmic groaning. The whole procedure takes only a few minutes. Speed was considered the most important virtue of an amputation surgeon. A faster surgery meant less time for the patient to be in agony, less blood loss, and theoretically, a lower chance of dying from shock. The famous surgeons of the era were renowned for how quickly they could remove a limb, sometimes in under a minute. Once the lower arm is severed, the real race against time begins. Silas tosses the saw aside and immediately has to deal with the bleeding. The tourniquet has stopped most of the blood flow, but the main arteries in the stump are still gushing. He uses a small, sharp hook to fish the arteries out of the mangled flesh. With a pair of pliers and the waxed thread, he quickly ties them off. This process, lighting the arteries, was the most crucial step. If he missed one, or if the knots didn't hold, the man would bleed to death in minutes. A strange and rather gruesome innovation from this period was the use of the surgeon's own teeth. In the heat of the moment, if his hands were occupied or slippery with blood, a surgeon might use his teeth to grasp and hold a ligature not tight before it was fully tied. It's a testament to the brutal and giganthic realities of pre-modern surgery. The historical debate here is a grim one. What were the actual survival rates? It's a difficult number to pin down for pirate ships, as they didn't keep meticulous records. We have to extrapolate from naval and military records of the time. For a primary amputation, one performed within 48 hours of the injury. The survival rates were shockingly low by modern standards, but perhaps higher than you'd expect. A limb amputation by a reasonably skilled surgeon might have a survival rate of around 70-75%. However, this number is deceptive. It only counts those who survived the immediate procedure and the days following. The real killer was what came next: infection. So, while you might survive the table, your chances of dying from gangrene or sepsis in the following weeks were still incredibly high. Historians also debate the psychological toll on the surgeons themselves. These men, whether they were carpenters or cooks, were not psychopaths. They were ordinary sailors forced into an extraordinary and horrific role. What did it do to a man's psyche to regularly inflict such pain, even in the service of saving a life? To hear those screams, to feel the bone grate under your saw. The copious amounts of rum consumed by surgeons before an operation were not just for the patient's benefit. It was a way for the surgeon to steady his own nerves, to numb his own empathy enough to get the job done. Silas finishes tying off the arteries. The bleeding has slowed to a trickle. He pulls the flap of skin he created back down over the raw stump and begins to stitch it shut with his large, crude needle. The sailor has finally, mercifully, passed out. The deck is slick with blood. The severed hand and forearm lie on the planks. A pale, forgotten thing. The immediate crisis is over. The butchery is complete, but the young man's ordeal is far from finished. The greatest threat to his life has only just begun to gather in the air around his open wound. The amputation is complete, but the work is not done. The stump of the young sailor's arm is raw, open where, a gaping invitation to every form of bacteria floating in the ship's filthy air. Silas knows, from grim experience, that a wound like this will almost always go bad. He doesn't understand the science of germs, but he understands the result. Pus, swelling, fever, and death. He must now take the final, brutal step in pirate surgery, cauterization. He gestures to the brazier, where the pot of thick, black tar has been bubbling away, sending up acrid plumes of smoke. Another crewman, using a thick leather rag, carefully lifts the pot and brings it over. The heat radiating from it is intense. Silas takes a wooden ladle, dips it into the pot, and pulls out a steaming, viscous glob of molten tar. This is the pirate's antibiotic. Cauterization, the practice of burning a wound to stop bleeding and cleanse. It was an ancient and widely used medical technique. The most common method was to use a red-hot piece of iron, a cautery, and press it directly into the wound. It was excruciatingly painful, but effective at sealing blood vessels. On a ship, however, heating an iron to the required temperature was a fire hazard, but they had something just as good and readily available. Tar. The same tar used to waterproof the ship's hull was their go-to medical supply. Silas holds the ladle of bubbling tar over the freshly stitched stump. There is a moment of hesitation, even for a man who just sawed through bone. This is a grim task. He takes a breath and then, in one swift motion, he pours the searing hot liquid directly onto the wound. The effect is instantaneous and horrific. The sailor, who had been mercifully unconscious, is shocked back to life. His body convulses with a violence that even the four men holding him can barely contain. A terrible, hissing, sizzling sound fills the air as the hot tar meets raw flesh. The smell is indescribable, a nauseating combination of burning meat, tar, and blood. The sailor's screams are choked and raw, the sound of a man being pushed beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. The theory behind this barbaric practice was twofold. First, the heat would seal any remaining small blood vessels that the ligatures might have missed, preventing further bleeding. Second, they believed that the hot tar would purify the wound, burning away the poisons that lead to infection. In a way, they were accidentally right. The intense heat would have sterilized the surface of the wound, killing any bacteria present. The layer of hardened tar would then form a crude, waterproof barrier, a kind of artificial scab, sealing the wound off from the filthy environment. It was a shotgun approach to antisepsis, brutal, agonizing, but not entirely without a twisted sort of logic. A less common, but equally terrifying, method of cauterization involved using gunpowder. The surgeon would sprinkle a fine layer of black powder into the wound and then briefly touch it with a hot coal or a lit fuse. The resulting flash would sear the tissue. This was called firing the wound. It was faster than tar, but also far less controlled and incredibly dangerous on a wooden ship filled with barrels of the stuff. The historical debate here centers on the efficacy versus the brutality of these methods. Did cauterization actually improve survival rates? Modern medical historians are divided. Some argue that, in a pre-antibiotic world, this kind of aggressive, kill-everything approach might have been the lesser of two evils. The damage caused by the burn was severe, but it might have prevented a fatal systemic infection like gangrene or sepsis. The burn itself was a sterile injury, in a way. Others argue that the massive tissue damage caused by the burn would have actually created a better environment for anaerobic bacteria like the kind that cause tetanus and gangrene to thrive deep within the wound. underneath the protective layer of tar. They contend that the practice was likely more harmful than helpful. A painful and dramatic ritual born of desperation rather than sound medical reasoning. We will likely never know for sure. As the control group, those who received no cauterization also had dismal survival rates. Silas steps back, his work finally done. The young sailor has, once again, lapsed into unconsciousness. His arm is a blackened, smoky ruin, coated in a thick, shiny layer of tar that is already beginning to cool and harden. He is alive. For now, he has survived the injury and the surgery. He has endured a level of pain that is almost unimaginable. He has been cut, sewn, stitched, and burned. Now, all he can do is lie in his filthy hammock, burning with fever, while his body wages a silent war against the invisible enemies that have already invaded his bloodstream. The surgeon's work is over, but the real battle for survival has just begun. The days following the amputation are tense. Grimwatch, the young sailor, whose name is Well, lies in his hammock, drifting in undoubt of a feverish delirium. His stump, now hard, black, tar-coated lung, throbs with a life of its own. Silas checks on him daily, but there is little he can do beyond offering him sips of grog-laced water and changing the crude bandages, which are already stained with a foul-smelling sepia. This is the most dangerous period. The trauma of the surgery is over, but the threat of infection is at its peak. Every pirate knew the signs to watch for. A redness spreading up the arm from the wound. A foul, sweetish smell of decay. A fever that wouldn't break. These were the telltale signs of what they called putrefaction or mortification. We call it gangrene. On this ship, infection is not a risk. It is a certainty. The concept of sterility is completely alien. Silas's hands were dirty. His tools were rusty. The air itself was thick with pathogens. The threads used to stitch the wound were not sterile. The very fabric of the hammock lies in is teeming with bacteria. An open wound in this environment is like leaving a piece of fresh meat out in the sun. It is going to go bad. The only question is how bad, and how fast. To illustrate the danger, you don't even need to look at a catastrophic injury like an amputation. Consider a simple, everyday injury. A few days ago, you were hauling on a rope and a splinter, thick as a matchstick, drove itself deep into the palm of your hand. You pulled it out, cursed, and thought nothing more of it. But now, your hand is swollen, red, and hot to the touch. A network of red lines, like thin, angry rivers, is beginning to snake its way up your arm from the small puncture wound. The area around the wound is puffy and tender, and a thick, yellow pus oozes out when you press on it. You have a fever, and your arm aches with a deep, throbbing pain. A tiny splinter has become a potentially lethal infection. This is how quickly things can turn. A minor cut from a knife, a scraped knuckle from a brawl, a rope burn, any breach in the skin's defense is a gateway to death. The pirates' own lifestyle exacerbated the problem. They were often malnourished, their immune systems already compromised by scurvy and exhaustion. They lived in filth, surrounded by vermin. Their understanding of wound care was not existent. The common practice of washing a wound with seawater, for instance, would introduce a host of marine bacteria. Using a dirty rag to wipe away blood would just rub more germs into the flesh. Here's a small, but telling detail about 18th century life. The marble pus. For a very long time, physicians believed that the formation of thick, white or yellow pus in a wound was a good sign. They thought it was the body expelling the bad humors or poisons from the injury. They would be concerned if a wound was dry. We now know. Of course, that pus is the exact opposite of a good sign. It's the debris of a massive battle between your white blood cells and invading bacteria. It is a sign of a raging infection. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that even trained surgeons were looking for the very symptoms of infection and interpreting them as signs of healing. The historical debate here is statistical and grim. What was the leading cause of death for the average pirate? Was it a cannonball in a naval battle? A cutlass in a duel? Execution by the authorities? Or was it something far more mundane? While the dramatic ends are the ones we remember, many historians argue that the most common cause of death for a pirate was, by a significant margin, disease and infection. For every pirate who went out in a blaze of glory, swinging from the yardarm, there were probably 10 who died slowly and miserably in their hammocks from dysentery, typhus, scurvy, or a festering wound that started with a splinter. The pirate life was a constant gamble, but the odds were stacked against them in ways they didn't even understand. Their greatest enemy was the Royal Navy. It was the microscopic world of bacteria and viruses they carried with them everywhere they went. Their lifestyle, their diet, their living conditions, it was all perfectly designed to cultivate and spread disease. The filth was just a matter of discomfort or bad smells. It was an active, relentless, and efficient killer. You look at your own swollen, red hand, and a cold fear grips you. It's the same fear you see in the eyes of the crew as they look at Will. They are not looking at him with pity anymore, but with a kind of detached, clinical dread. They are watching to see which way the battle will go. Will his body's natural defenses, weakened as they are, somehow win out? Or will the infection overwhelm him? His fate is a preview of what could happen to any one of them, at any time, from the smallest of mistakes. Your tiny splinter and his amputated arm are just different doors to the same darkroom. After what feels like an eternity adrift in a sea of misery, the cry everyone has been desperate to hear rings out from the lookout perched high on the mast. Land ho! The effect on the crew is electric. Men who were just hours before slumped in a lethargic score, but I cease to now find a new reserve of energy. They rush to the rails, their eyes straining to see the hazy, green smudge on the horizon. Land. It means fresh water that doesn't taste of slime. It means fresh food, fruits, vegetables, perhaps some fresh meat from a wild pig or goat, for the men suffering from scurvy. It means a potential cure, a chance to halt the slow motion decay of their bodies, for everyone. It means a break from the monotonous, rolling prison of the ship. As you draw closer, the island reveals itself to be a lush, tropical paradise, exactly the kind you see in pictures. White sandy beaches, a thick jungle of green, and rocky coves. The captain finds a secluded, hidden bay to drop anchor, a place where you are unlikely to be spotted by any passing naval patrols. The first boats are lowered, and they are filled not with shore parties ready for a fight, but with men carrying empty water casks. The first priority is always water. Once the essential task of restocking water and foraging for edible plants is underway, the true nature of a pirate's shore leave begins to reveal itself. It is not a restful vacation. It is a sudden, explosive release of every pent-up frustration, fear, and desire that has been simmering for months at sea. The strict discipline of the ship, which was necessary for survival, dissolves almost instantly. The men hit the beach like a tidal wave of chaos. They build massive bonfire. They break out the reserve barrels from the good stuff, not the watered-down grog. The goal is to get as drunk as humanly possible, as quickly as possible. The air fills with raucous singing. shouting, and the occasional crack of a pistol being fired into the air for no particular reason. They feast on roasted fish and whatever fruits and strange animals they've managed to catch. After weeks of hardtack and salt pork, the taste of fresh, fire-roasted food is a transcendent experience. They gorge themselves until they are sick. This period of shore leave, whether on a deserted island or, more famously, in a notorious pirate haven like Port Royal or Nassau, was a critical part of the pirate life cycle. It was a pressure valve. The immense stress, filth, and brutality of life at sea was temporarily forgotten in a blur of alcohol and excess. It was here that they would spend their plundered loot with reckless abandon. On drink, on gambling, on anything that offered a moment's pleasure. A strange but common activity during these shore leave binges was careening the ship. This was essential maintenance. The ship would be sailed into a shallow bay and intentionally beached on its side during a low tide. This exposed one half of the ship's hull, which would be covered in a thick layer of barnacles, seaweed, and shipworms. The crew, often while nursing monumental hangovers, would have to scrape the entire hull clean and then reapply a fresh coat of tar and tallow. It was back-breaking, filthy work, but it was vital. A clean hull made the ship much faster and more maneuverable, a critical advantage for a vessel that relied on speed to catch its prey and escape its enemies. The historical debate here concerns the function of these pirate havens. Were places like Nassau simply dens of vice and lawlessness, chaotic free-for-alls where pirates could let loose? Or were they something more? Some historians argue that these ports were sophisticated, functional microeconomies. They were places where pirates could not only spend their money, but also recruit new members, repair and refit their ships, and sell their stolen goods. They had a complex ecosystem of merchants, tavern owners, and craftsmen who were willing to trade with pirates, effectively laundering their stolen wealth and providing the essential services they needed to continue their operations. These havens weren't just parties. They were crucial logistical hubs for the entire enterprise of piracy. You sit by a bonfire, a roasted banana in one hand and a coconut shell full of rum in the other. The noise is deafening. Two men are having a drunken wrestling match in the sand. Another is trying to teach a parrot to curse. The feeling of solid ground beneath you is a luxury you had forgotten. The taste of fresh food is a miracle. But as you look around at the chaos, you see the dark side of this release. The arguments are more heated, fueled by rum. The casual violence that was always simmering just below the surface on the ship is now out in the open. Fights break out. Knives are drawn. This isn't just a party. It's a collective, nervous breakdown. It's the violent, messy, and self-destructive behavior of men who don't expect to live very long, and are determined to burn as brightly and as quickly as they can. The shore leave is not a cure for the sickness of their lives. It's just another, more explosive, symptom of it. The drunken shore leave lasts for days. A blur of rum-soaked feasts and feverish work careening the ship. The fresh fruit works its magic on the crew's scurvy-ravaged bodies. The bleeding gums begin to heal. The lethargy lifts, and the pain in their joints subsides. It feels like a miracle, a resurrection, but the respite is temporary, and it does little to mask the underlying, unromantic truth of a pirate's existence. As the chaos of the beach party winds down, you take a moment to look at your crewmates in the harsh light of a sober morning. The fresh food has brought some color back to their cheeks, but the marks of their profession are permanent. There's Will, the young sailor who lost his hand. He survived the infection, thanks to a robust constitution and a great deal of luck. He is now learning to tie knots with one hand, and a hook his carpenter surgeon fashioned for him he will carry that injury for the rest of his life. A constant reminder of one moment of inattention. There are the men with the missing teeth, permanent gaps in their smiles courtesy of scurvy. There are the men with the deep, hacking coughs that will never leave them, a legacy of pneumonia or tuberculosis fostered in the damp confines of the birth deck. There are the men with the livid scars from knife fights and the pitted skin from long-forgotten fevers. They are a crew of the walking wounded, men whose bodies are a living record of the filth, disease, and violence that defines their lives. This is the ultimate, unglamorous reality of the golden age of piracy. The romantic image we have is of swashbuckling adventure, of chests overflowing with gold, of a life of absolute freedom on the high seas. But that was only a tiny fraction of the experience. The reality was a near constant state of discomfort, misery, and illness. The true enemies of the pirate were not the cannons of the Royal Navy, but the insidious, invisible foes that lived on their own ships and in their own bodies. The greatest killer of pirates was not combat, but disease, dysentery, typhus, scurvy, malaria, yellow fever, and infections from minor wounds claimed far more lives than any cutlass or cannonball. A pirate's career was almost always short, and it rarely ended with a peaceful retirement on a tropical island with a chest of treasure. The most common end for a pirate was a slow, agonizing death from sickness in a filthy hammock 1,000 miles from home. The second most common was likely at the end of a rope, as the authorities eventually captured them. The successful pirate who got away with the loot was the rare exception, not the rule. A small, often overlooked fact is what pirates did with their treasure. While some of it was spent on the wild binges in port, much of the really valuable, non-monetary loot like spices, fabrics, or sugar had to be sold. This required a network of shady merchants and corrupt officials who were willing to fence stolen goods. This business side of piracy is far less exciting than the battles, but it was essential. A pirate crew was, in many ways, a violent, dysfunctional trading company. They had to manage logistics, maintain their vessel, and find a market for their product, all while being hunted by the law. This brings us to the final, great historical debate about the end of the golden age of piracy around the 1722 and 1732. Why did it end? There was no single reason. The nations of Europe, tired of the disruption to their colonial trade, began to commit serious military resources to hunting pirates down. They offered pardons to those who would give up the life, and aggressively prosecuted those who wouldn't. The notorious pirate havens were cleaned up or destroyed. The economic conditions that had created a large pool of desperate, unemployed sailors after major wars began to stabilize. In essence, the business model of piracy became much less profitable and much more dangerous. The risk no longer justified the potential reward. It was a single, decisive battle that ended piracy. It was a slow strangulation, a war of attrition and economics. You stand on the deck of the newly cleaned and dray-supplied ship, ready to set sail again. The brief, chaotic joy of shore leave is over. Ahead of you lies the familiar reality, the rocking of the ship, the bland food, the constant dampness, the ever-present stench. You are healthier now than you were a week ago, but you know it's only a matter of time before the cycle begins again. The weevils are still in the biscuits. The water will go foul. The diseases are just dormant, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. The romantic dream of the pirate's life has been completely stripped away, leaving only the grimy, painful, and desperate truth. It is not a life of freedom, but a frantic race against a dozen different kinds of slow and dignified death. You look out at the vast, empty ocean, and for the first time, you don't see adventure. You see a watering grave, waiting patiently. The ship slips away from the island, a dark shape against the deepening twilight. The sounds of the shore, the birds, the insects, the crashing waves fade behind you, replaced by the familiar symphony of the vessel itself, the groan of the timbers, the flap of the sails, the gentle, rhythmic creak of the mast. It is the sound of your world, this small, self-contained universe of wooden rope and misery. You are heading back into the void. You find your hammock in the dark, the air already growing thick with the smell of unwashed men. You lie back, the gentle rocking motion of familiar, if unsettling, cradle. The stars through the open hatch are brilliant, cold, and impossibly distant. They seem to look down on your small, filthy world with a complete and utter indifference. The journey has changed you. The calluses on your hands are thicker, your skin is weathered, and your eyes have the haunted, faraway look of someone who has seen too much. You have learned to live with a level of filth and discomfort you once would have thought impossible. You have learned to eat things that would have made you sick to even look at before. You have learned that life is fragile, and that death comes in many forms, most of them slow and without glory. The ship sails on into the night, a tiny spark of life in an immense darkness, and as the rocking motion lulls you, your mind begins to drift. The harsh realities of the deck, the pain in your joints, the constant itch, they all begin to soften, to blur at the edges. The rhythmic creaking of the ship becomes a soothing mantra. The stench fades into a familiar background hum. You are no longer on a pirate ship. You are simply floating, suspended in a warm, quiet darkness. The gentle sway of the hammock is now the gentle sway of sleep itself, pulling you down into its soft, quiet depths. The world of terror, sickness, and salt dissolves, replaced by the formless, peaceful landscape of a dream. You are safe now, in the quiet harbor of your own mind. The long, difficult voyage is over for tonight. Rest now. Just rest. The end of the article. Good night.